Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 382 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about demons, magic, and other mysterious subjects. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, be sure to stick around to the end of the episode. We'll have your feedback on our recent episode on Bigfoot biology. But first, people of all stripes are interested in mysterious subjects. Sometimes these include things that are dark, like demons and magic, and how they relate to religion. Some have taken an intense interest in these subjects, and some actually practice ceremonial magic. This can generate a lot of questions. And recently, Jimmy was asked to come on a podcast called Glitch Bottle, which focuses on ceremonial magic. So what is magic? What did the Glitch Bottle audience want to know? And what was Jimmy able to share with them? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So, Jimmy, what are we doing in today's episode?
Both this week and next, we're going to be watching an interview that I recently did on Glitch Bottle. This is a podcast run by a gentleman named Alexander Eth, and the podcast focuses on magic and the esoteric. Many of the episodes have to do with ceremonial magic, which is not the same thing as stage magic. Instead, ceremonial magicians are trying to practice actual real-world magic. Alex also interviews people on other related subjects. For example, he's interviewed the Jewish esoteric scholar Justin Sledge, who I interviewed back in episodes 218 and 219 on the Kabbalah, and I plan to have Justin back on the show on other topics as well. Alex has also interviewed the British Assyriologist Dr. Irving Finkel, who's the author of the book The First Ghosts, about ghosts in ancient Mesopotamia. And I also hope to have Dr. Finkel here on Mysterious World. You'll hear both Alex and me refer to both Justin Sledge and Irving Finkel during this interview. Well, Alex is aware that I'm a Catholic who knows something about magic and the esoteric. He's also heard the way I try to be friendly to everybody, no matter what point of view they're coming from. And he thought that I'd have a perspective that would be of interest for his audience, so he invited me on his show. He asked his audience what questions they'd like to ask me as a Catholic, so you'll hear me answering a lot of audience questions in the interview. Overall, the interview lasted for 4 hours. So today we'll be listening to part 1 of the interview, and next week we'll be listening to part 2.
It's interesting that you'd be invited to answer questions for ceremonial magicians. Not a lot of Catholic apologists get invitations like that.
Yeah, well, I get invitations to go on podcasts from all kinds of different perspectives. I think it's because of the way I try to interact with every perspective in a fair and open-minded way, and I try to be friendly with people. In fact, just 2 days before I did this interview, I had a debate with an atheist on the resurrection of Jesus, and that was on a philosophy channel that's agnostic. That debate isn't out yet, but I'll let people know when it is. So I had a debate with an atheist one day, and then 2 days later, I'm having a conversation with ceremonial magicians, which I thought was interesting, getting to talk to people from such different parts of the spectrum of belief.
Are there any things you try to do when talking to people who don't know you and are coming from such different perspectives?
Yeah, I want to be of whatever help I can to people, no matter what their beliefs are, whether they agree with mine or not. And part of that is showing them that I'm friendly and that I don't fit the stereotypes that they may be familiar with. For example, I can imagine how magicians might suspect that I'd simply come on and, be hostile to them, dousing everything they do is demonic and so forth. So in the conversation we'll be hearing today, it was important to me to show that I'm not hostile. In fact, I'm a regular guy. I have a sense of humor. I'm interested in a bunch of different subjects, not just Catholicism. Those were all things I wanted to show them. And I wanted to show them that I try to think about matters in a discerning way and sort the good from the bad while still applying Catholic principles. Thus, particularly towards the front part of the interview, which is the part we'll be hearing today, I note a number of times of how I'm trying to distinguish the good from the bad and not simply dismissing other positions as nothing but bad, which implicitly invites them to similarly think in a discerning manner about the Catholic faith and maybe recognize good in it, which, can help them on their own journeys with God. Anyway, those are some of the principles I try to apply in interviews, particularly when interacting with folks from a different perspective who may have encountered stereotypes and who, frankly, may have even encountered Christians who have been hostile to them in the past.
Is there anything else we should know before getting into today's interview?
One thing is a technical term that we haven't used a lot yet here on Mysterious World. Since the mid-1800s, English has had a technical term for a kind of book known as a grimoire. It comes from the French word grammaire, which means grammar or incantation. So a grimoire is a book of incantations. In other words, it's a book of rituals or spells used in ceremonial magic. Although the term grimoire comes from the mid-1800s, we have grimoires that date back to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and they were sometimes used by Catholic priests and other clergy, which leads us to a subject that's been called the clerical necromantic underworld, which comes up in our discussion, so you'll be hearing about that. The only other things to know is that there are a bunch of references to previous Mysterious World episodes, particularly in part 1 of the interview, because I've talked about a lot of the same concepts that we discussed in this interview before. That's part of how Alex knew I knew about these subjects. And in the video version of the podcast, we'll put references on screen so that you can look up the episodes if you'd like. And that's, I guess, what folks ought to know.
Okay, then, let's listen to part 1 of your interview from Glitch Bottle. But first, I want to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Michael F., Shiloh S., Michael P., Glenn D., and Daniel C. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. More than 90% of our financial support comes from individual donors like you, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by Father Robert Spitzer and the Magis Center's new Critical Catholic Cosmology program. Join a community of adults and educators seeking to grapple with the truth claims of science, philosophy, and the Bible in a classroom environment, with special appearances by Father Spitzer. Ground your faith in evidence with a critical method that integrates heart and mind. Earn 6 graduate credits over 2 semesters at a third of the cost of most graduate programs. Online or in person in the Boston area on Tuesdays beginning October 7th. Go to magiscenter.com/institute. magiscenter.com/institute, or search Critical Catholic Cosmology to register today.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Eth, and today we are so elated to talk about Catholic theology and teaching regarding magic, the grimoires, exorcism, demons, and more with Catholic theologian, philosopher, and author Jimmy Akin. Now, Jimmy, as I know many of you listeners know, is not only a Catholic theologian, and Jimmy is often seen sharing church teaching as the senior apologist at Catholic Answers. Jimmy is also a prolific author. One of my favorite books, by the way, listeners, check this out. We'll have links below, is Teaching with Authority, about what the church really says in its documents. But in addition to all of that, Jimmy Akin is the proprietor of an excellent podcast, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where he uses both faith and reason to explore Catholic theology, but also subjects like magic, esotericism, aliens, UFOs, Freemasonry, cryptids, and other mysterious topics. And today with Jimmy, we hope to delve deep into questions like, what does the Catholic Church teach when it comes to magic? What are demons? What does Catholic teaching say leads to diabolic possession? As we've discussed on the show many times, magic and Catholicism have deep entwining historical roots or similar touch points going back literally 1,000 years and more. And as someone who grew up Catholic, I was an altar boy, went to a Catholic middle school, I want to know the Catholic theological thinking on esotericism, but also to challenge my own beliefs on the grimoires, on esoteric practice, and more. And I want to fully understand the church's positions on esotericism as I navigate my own path in life and think about my own esoteric practice. But hopefully, listeners, for you, this chat with such an esteemed theologian will be a great thought starter for you as well. And so, with all that being said, Jimmy Akin, thank you so much for taking the time and stopping on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Well, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. And, I got your invitation to come on. I'm happy to talk with anybody about anything, almost, and just want to be of whatever service I can. One of the things that people could maybe infer from your very kind introduction is I'm not one of those people. Some people in the Christian community have a reputation for just being entirely negative towards various things, the paranormal or, and so forth, and just saying, no, it's all demons. And I specifically reject that approach. In fact, I have a whole episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. It's episode 188, if people want to check it out, where I highlight the dangers of taking that approach. And I think it's really important to take a balanced approach that's nuanced, where we attempt to, as St. Paul says, test everything and hold fast to what is good. And there's going to be good in anything that humans are attracted to. There's always some good in there. And, some things are better than others, but we want to take an open-minded and discerning approach to everything rather than just shooting from the hip and rejecting things.
Well, listeners, I hope you can appreciate this as much as I do. Jimmy, thank you, because we were chatting before the podcast, and I'll absolutely say it again. One of the things that I'm incredibly thankful for is that you always approach conversations with a spirit of charity, and you also meet people where they're at, no matter what the topic is. And so, thank you, Jimmy. And perhaps the best place to start maybe will be to lay some foundational questions for Catholic teaching. So, Jimmy, can you share with us, for the listeners out there, what actually are demons in Catholic theology?
Okay, so this is something that has the development of the terminology has changed over time. As people will know, the Christian faith is rooted in the Jewish faith. And in Judaism, there are a variety of different classes of heavenly creatures that we read about. God, of course, is the creator. Any created being is a creature. Some creatures are earthly, like, humans and animals and so forth. But other creatures are heavenly. They're native to heaven. And there are a number of different names for them that get used in the Old Testament. The most familiar one today is angels, and that comes from a Greek term, angelos, that means messenger. But that Greek term gets introduced in a significant way in the New Testament, although it's also there to some degree in the Greek version of the Old Testament, which is known as the Septuagint. But if you go to the original Hebrew and Aramaic Old Testament, you actually find there are a variety of different terms that are used for spiritual creatures. And these include, for example, the seraphim, which are described, for example, in the book of Isaiah. And they're sort of actually serpentine creatures that are used. They have a snake-like form, and they are used as throne room guardians. So they protect the unauthorized. They protect the divine throne against anyone who's unauthorized approaching it. And it similarly, you see creatures like this. They're sort of winged snakes. I actually have an episode of Mysterious World about winged snakes, but you see similar creatures, which this seraphim are based on, in Egyptian iconography, where they're presented as figures that are known as uraeuses, which are similarly they're like winged snakes, and they serve as guardians of sacred space. Another creature that we read about are known in English as the cherubim, and they are depicted in a variety of different ways, but they are also all over ancient Near Eastern iconography. You see pictures of them, for example. Sometimes they look like winged bulls with human heads, and they are depicted, for example, in Mesopotamian iconography, and they have a different function. Sometimes they're used in the Hebrew scriptures as divine steeds. It talks at various points about God riding on the cherubim and so forth. Although they also have other functions. When Adam and Eve get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, God has cherubim who come in and guard the Garden of Eden to keep mankind from going back there. Then you read about the messengers. We're not at this point using the Greek term angelos. They're malachim, and they serve as messengers who run errands for God and communicate messages for God. We also read about other heavenly officials. Sometimes they're called sons of God, and they serve as high court officials. They're not the little low guys who are running messages. There's also the Lord's army, and it has a commander. And so we read about quite a variety of different heavenly creatures. What happened by the Christian age, though, was the term, since we humans most commonly interact with the messengers, with the low-down guys in the hierarchy, is the term for them came to be applied to everything. And so in the Christian age, the term angel evolved to mean any heavenly creature, so not the creator, not God, but any heavenly creature is called an angel. And so today, the way the term is used, an angel is a created being that is not human, and is not material. It doesn't have a body like we do. And that's how angels are understood. Now, there's sort of a parallel trajectory with the term demon. In the Hebrew term for demon is shed. And so there are a number of passages that talk about, like, the gods of the nations are shadim, they're demons. There are also some specific types of demons that get mentioned. One of them is Lilith, which is understood in the Hebrew Bible. Different scholars interpret it differently. Some even will just interpret it as a night animal. But the better scholarship seems to indicate that it's essentially a Hebraicization of a demon, harmful spirit from Mesopotamian literature that would, for example, cause sudden infant death. And so you get Lilith mentioned, you get God's major adversary, Satan or Satan, mentioned, and basically a parallel catch-all term developed for these different harmful spirits. Now, if you go to almost any religion anywhere in the world, they're going to have a concept for a harmful spirit, and that can get translated into English as demon. The way that Christians use the term demon specifically, though, tends to be a bad angel. Remember, angel is the term for any heavenly creature, and if they go bad, then they get called a demon. And there are some indications of how that usage developed during the course of Judeo-Christian religious history. One of the things that the book of Deuteronomy talks about is when God divided the nations, he set them under some of the higher officials known as the sons of God in the heavenly court, or what's sometimes called the divine council. So he had these major heavenly figures who he put the nations under. But then some of them went bad. and they started doing things like demand and worship for themselves. And and that led to the description of the gods of the nations as shadim, or demons. So you can see how these beings who are originally heavenly, they're originally angelic, they're the sons of God, they go bad and they get described as demons. And we see an example of this in the book of Daniel. Towards the end of the book of Daniel, Daniel has a vision, and the angel Gabriel shows up to interpret the vision for him. And he's witnessed a conflict using the symbol of some animals. He sees this he-goat, a male goat, that conquers a large portion of the land. And he's told, this is the prince of Greece. And it's a reference to Alexander the Great and his conquests about 300 BC. But when Gabriel shows up, he says something very interesting. Gabriel doesn't show up for like 3 weeks. And when he shows up, he says, hey, I heard your prayer 3 weeks ago. Sorry, I'm late, but the prince of Greece resisted me. And the only reason I'm here now is because I called upon Michael, who is the prince that has charge of your people. And he's basically got the prince of Greece in a headlock right now. So he's doing this holding action on the prince of Greece, and I'm here to interpret the vision for you. And when I'm done interpreting the vision for you, I'm going to go back and help Michael, and we're going to whale the tar out of the prince of Greece. And then behold, once he's gone, the prince of Persia is going to rise. So this parallels how there was conflict between, actually, I think I have that backwards. I have Prince of Greece and Prince of Persia backwards. But this refers to the conflicts among the empires of the day. And what you see, though, is if all these guys, Michael and the Prince of Greece and the Prince of Persia, if they were all originally sons of God, but now they're fighting each other, obviously, some of them are now resisting God's will. And so this feeds into the idea that the gods of the nations are now demons. They've demanded worship for themselves. And there are other conceptions of demons too. A very common idea that was present in Second Temple Judaism and even earlier is that at some point in the past, at least some angels wanted to marry human women, and they gave birth to a race of, it's called the Nephilim. Some people will say that means fallen ones. It actually doesn't. It actually means giants. And in some Second Temple literature of Judaism, what demons are is the spirits of the giants. So they're sort of half human, half demonic, or half angelic creatures. So the term for demon has been used differently. In some religions, it just means a harmful spirit, and it could even be a human. So a human could become a demon. In Second Temple Judaism, these hybrid, half angelic, half human creatures could be called demons. But the way the term is used today, in Christian circles, it's a non-human spirit that is a creature and has gone bad.
That, listeners, I hope you appreciate that as much as I do. That's a wonderful foundation, Jimmy. And I think this, because you have these effectively warring spiritual creatures happening, you just touched on a very human element that I think a lot of people might see online. I know it's a lot that you've spoken and written about, which is when those warring spirits, those malevolent spirits, if you will, decide to specifically engage with or diabolically oppress or obsess or possess an individual human being, known as possession. There's a lot of information out there, a lot of claims out there regarding exorcisms. But Jimmy, given that very intricate history, can you talk about and share with us about the Catholic teaching on what possession is and what are some of the things that could lead to possession?
Well, there isn't so much a Catholic teaching about what possession is. We have examples of it in particularly in the New Testament, where a demon has seized control of somebody, and that get, so they like will even speak through the person. And we have examples where Jesus, for example, at one point goes to a territory that's inhabited by a people known as the Gadarenes, and he meets these demoniacs there, who are people that are basically inhabited by demons, and it affects their behavior. So that, for example, they become self-destructive, and they'll beat themselves with stones and things like that. They'll also become super strong. The Gospels note that the Gadarenes had tried to tie them up with chains, and they would just bust the chains. And they also affect the mental function of these people. So they will actually talk through the demoniacs, and they'll say oh, what do you have to do with us, Son of God, talking to Jesus? Have you come to torture us before the time? Because they're aware that they're not going to meet a good fate, and they want to know, are you going to do this to us early? And they eventually get permission to go into a herd of pigs, which Jesus then lets them do. But for my purposes, the point is they're talking through these people. And this seems to be an intermittent phenomenon. In another instance, in the Gospels, Jesus and some of his core disciples are coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and his other disciples have been trying to help out this father whose son has a demon, and it's manifested in the form of epilepsy. So the son is having epileptic fits, but he doesn't have them all the time. And so it seems intermittent when the demon manifests and causes the epilepsy versus when it's not manifesting. So there seem to be cases of someone has a demon, but they don't, they're not at the moment under the control of the demon, but then on other occasions they are, and they kind of move back and forth between these states. And from that, and from the experience that Christians have had in the last 2,000 years, there's kind of been built up a portrait of different forms of demonic activity, and that the strongest of those is possession, where the demon just assumes control of the person, at least intermittently. But there are other ways that demons can manifest also. They may, for example, harm the person in some way without assuming full control, and that's sometimes called obsession. There's also infestation, which is where they're attacking something other than a person. Maybe it's a place or an animal or something like that. And there are a number of different forms of demonic manifestation, but the church doesn't have a definition of possession. It leaves that up to demonologists to figure out.
Thank you, Jimmy. And because it kind of, there's a little bit of malleability there in terms of possession and what the teaching is. One of the very solid aspects of Catholic teaching, and I'd love for you to share with the listeners about this, is the role of an exorcist. It's obviously very popular, whether it's the 1970s exorcism movie or recently Russell Crowe, that movie with Father Amorth. It's a very popular thing. There's a lot of grimoire associations, which we might get into later. But can you tell us, Jimmy, what is an exorcist? Who is an exorcist? And what does the church teach regarding an exorcist and permission and everything else?
Okay, well, the office of exorcist has a substantial historical development. It hadn't always been the same. Originally, originally Jesus gave his 12 disciples, the ability to cast out spirits, but even in his day, it wasn't limited to them. They found other exorcists who were also, and there were Jewish exorcists. And basically, just like you go to any religion and it has some concept for harmful spirit. Well, no one wants to be bugged by harmful spirits. So every religion basically has a concept of exorcist, at least at some point in its history. And that's true in Mesopotamia, it's true in Judaism, it's true in Buddhism, it's true in Christianity. But in terms of Christian exorcists, as the church developed in the early centuries, the office of exorcist became more formal. And there came to be different types of exorcism that would be done. There was an idea that, okay, there are some bad spirits out there, and we want to make sure that even if they're not manifested, they could be having some kind, even if they're not seizing control of someone, they could be having some kind of influence that we don't want. But since they're not manifesting, it's not obvious, are they here? And so this led to, well, let's do a ritual to try to get rid of them, even if they're not manifesting. And this is what's known as a minor exorcism. And so actually for quite a number of centuries, there was this minor office in the church of exorcist that was actually one of the steps that you went through on your way to be an ordained priest. That's not really part of the Latin church today. I don't know what the status of exorcist is in all of the Eastern Catholic churches, which is not the same thing as Eastern Orthodox. That's a different group. But at least in the Latin Rite, you don't have this office of minor exorcist anymore. During much of church history, there was no requirement that you be a priest or even on your way to being a priest in order to drive out demons. Very often in the Middle Ages, it was anybody who's holy, and could do exorcisms. And so if you've got someone, they're a living saint, you want to use that holiness to get rid of these bad creatures. And so there were, among other things, there were female exorcists like St. Hildegard of Bingen, who's also a doctor of the church. She wrote exorcistic texts for people to use to, kick out these demons. And so it wasn't restricted to clerics, who are people that either are priests or are on their way to being priests. But eventually, the practice became more restricted to clerics, and in recent church law, it has been restricted even further in the Catholic Church to priests who are specifically designated by their bishop to do what are known as major exorcisms. Now, there are other things that you can do for harmful spirits that are not major exorcisms. Minor exorcisms still exist, but you don't have to be a priest to do them. And there's also what are known as deliverance prayers, which ordinary lay people can do. But if you want to do the full official rite of a major exorcism, you need to be a priest who has been specially designated by his bishop to do this rite.
Thank you, Jimmy. May I ask a quick follow-up question, as
Yeah.
this just occurred to me? Okay, thank you so much, Jimmy. I'll try and limit that because I have so many for you. But one of them is based on the literature that I've read with even modern exorcists, but also some of the Thomistic metaphysical scholarship. Tell me if this is accurate at all. This is my understanding, but I love your point about how the lines weren't so distinct in the Middle Ages. So would it be fair to say that all authority in Catholic theology flows from one of two buckets, broadly speaking, either authority from the natural law or authority flowing from the divine positive law? And if you have this authority, for instance, as a layperson, I do not have the authority to go around and start, exorcising people or laying hands on people. But if you had a child or somebody, you're staying within the authority structures of the natural law. Whereas now the divine positive law allows a priest, as you were saying, to do that. Would that be even somewhat in the ballpark of accurate, or can you just clarify that a little bit?
I think there are elements of truth there, or at least elements that are consistent with certain theories about how exorcism works. But I would say the actual lay of the land is a little more complex than that. So one of the things that happened in the mid 20th century was exorcism largely went into eclipse in the Catholic Church. There were very few, it was an age dominated by skepticism and a kind of rejection of anything that might be considered superstitious. There was the rise of psychiatry and psychology in the 20th century, which led lots of people to say, demons, that's just a mental illness and stuff like that. And so very few bishops, due to the spirit of the age, were appointing exorcists, and the number of exorcists got quite small. And then in the pontificate of John Paul II, there began a kind of renaissance of exorcists where this element of Christian history was retrieved. You even had some theologians before that retrieval who would say things like, oh yeah, demons are just symbols of, they're not really other entities. They're really just symbols of dark elements in the human psyche and stuff like that. Or they're a personalization of illnesses like the epileptic boy. And they'd say, oh, well, he didn't have epilepsy. He did have epilepsy, and they interpreted it as being caused by a demon instead of actually being demon-induced epilepsy. And so you had this very skeptical approach. But then in the reign of John Paul II, we got, for example, the Catechism of the Catholic Church in 1992, and it reaffirmed the traditional Catholic teaching that, yeah, demons are bad angels. And also John Paul II prepared a new rite of exorcism that came out in 1998 and complements the 1614 rite of exorcism, which previously had been the standard in Latin-speaking Christianity. So there's been this retrieval of exorcistic practice in Catholic circles, and that's led to a regrowth of the exorcistic community. But because there was that bottleneck in there, what I've found is there is the church actually doesn't teach that much about exorcism. It has two rites for getting rid of the demons, but those two rites don't contain a huge amount of information. They don't settle all the questions you would want answered. And so that's led to exorcists and other demonologists proposing answers to these questions. But because there's not a church teaching here, there's a diversity of opinion. And so I find in studying the exorcistic and demonological communities, there are different schools of thought about, like, how do you get possessed and how do you get the demon out? How do you get unpossessed? And which theory a particular exorcist or demonologist tends to endorse is usually based on who they were exposed to or who they were trained by. And they'll often, especially some of the ones you see in the popular media, they'll often just say, well, this is how it works. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's the theory of one school, but that's not what all exorcists or what all demonologists think. And they'll just say their own view as if it were the truth, even though there's not a church teaching here and there are other opinions which they either don't know about or aren't paying attention to when they're given their own opinion. To give an example now, the scenario you just asked about was heavily dependent on the idea of God-given authority. Could I, for example, do deliverance prayers over my child, even though I haven't been given the authority to do a major exorcism? Well, it's my child. I have a natural law authority over my child. So could I do something in this area? Okay, well, that presupposes that authority plays a big role in all of this. And I don't deny that authority plays a role, but is it the authority itself or is it something else that is producing the efficacy in terms of how to get the demon out? For example, there are some exorcists who have a legal theory of exorcism, and they will say things like demons are big rule keepers. They will not go in and try to possess a person unless that person has given them the right to enter them and possess them. And then effectively the exorcist comes along, he hangs up an eviction notice and says, by the authority of Christ and his church, you're kicked out, and they leave. Okay, interesting theory. How well supported is it by the data? And I don't think that theory is particularly well supported. In the first place, there are instances like the boy in the Gospels who it's hard to see him do it. His father says he's been like this since he was an infant. And it's hard to see an infant doing anything that would allow demons in to take control. Infants don't have the capacity to do things like that. So I would say that's one problem. Another problem, if demons are such great rule keepers, they wouldn't be demons. They would be keeping the rules up in heaven just like all the good angels. So we know they're rule breakers. And then thirdly, if it was just a matter of hanging up the eviction notice with the proper, legal formalities, they should leave immediately. And exorcistic experience indicates they don't. It can take a considerable amount of time and multiple sessions of exorcism to get all the demons out of a person. So it's not as simple as just saying you're legally on notice, get out of here, because they don't respond to that, at least not immediately. So I think that this legalistic understanding of possession and exorcism is not particularly well supported by the data. That doesn't mean that authority plays no role in it, but I think it's more complex than that. Another theory that a different group of exorcists will, so one of the problems with that some have pointed out with that first view that I described is it blames the victim. If you're saying, okay, you somehow did something to let these demons in, you're blaming the person. But a lot of exorcists have the experience of, the person didn't do anything wrong. And so some of them have gone to another theory, which also has some historic roots, where they'll say, someone put a spell on you, they cursed you, and that's how you got possessed. And some figures like Father Gabriel Amorth, who was a very popular recent exorcist, he's passed on now, but this was his theory about how most possessed people become possessed. He thought someone put a curse or a spell on them. I also don't think, and that does alleviate the problem of blaming the victim. But I think that the evidence for all these possessed people had a curse on them is also not particularly good. I think, and this is my own theory, is that demons are like bears. They're opportunistic. And so you don't have to, if you're out in the woods, you don't have to invite the bears in. And no one has to sick a bear on you. If you encounter a bear and you're vulnerable, the bear may decide to exploit that situation. Like, let's take all of his food and even eat him if need be. So I think that demons are like bears. I think they're opportunistic predators, spiritually speaking. And so I don't blame the victim either, but I also don't tie it to some kind of legal contract that the person has to enter into with the demon. I don't find good evidence for that. So that's my theory of how at least most possessions occur. I think it's an unfortunate encounter by a person who's in a vulnerable state, and the demon decides to exploit it. So what about exorcism? How does that work? Well, one of the things, what I propose, one of the distinguishing characteristics of demons, and this is actually mentioned in it's called the Praenotanda. It's basically the introduction to the rites of exorcism, the 1614 and the 1998. But one of the things it talks about is that demons have a notable aversion to the holy. So it's like they don't want to say the name Jesus. They don't want to look at a picture of the Virgin Mary. They don't want to have anything to do with anything that's holy. And so my thought is, depending on how you want to put it, you could say exorcism is a holiness stink bomb, or it's a holiness overload. And what you're trying to do is do enough actions that are holy that it causes the demon to just say, this isn't worth it anymore. I'm getting out of here. And I think that actually is well supported by the data. One of the things you find when you read the 1614 rite of exorcism is that it says that when the exorcist finds something that is particularly distressing to the demon, do more of that. You know, just if you find this one prayer and it's really causing the demon a lot of pain, say that prayer more. You find the parts that are the most punishing, the most hurtful for this demon, and you drill down on those. And okay, to me, that sounds like you're doing some kind of overload that the demon can't stand. And that would explain why they hang around for a while. It's not just like hanging up a notice, but they do eventually leave. It's because eventually they get sick of this holiness they're being exposed to. And as part of that, saying, hey, by the way, I've got the power of Christ's church behind me, and Christ orders you to leave, and you're going to get judged on Judgment Day, and it's going to be worse for you if you don't leave. And I tell you this by the power of Christ and the power of his church, and the Pope's on board with this, and I've got authorization from my bishop. That's just building in more and more holiness that's going to make it harder for the demon to stay. So I would say that those who appeal to authority as playing a role here do have a point. But I would just say it seems to be more complex than that.
This is fascinating. Thank you, Jimmy. Yeah, I'm taking some notes here.
By the way, that also would explain something that we see in the Gospels, because Jesus gives the 12 apostles authority to kick out spirits. So that tells us authority is relevant. But he also, when the disciples come up to him and they say, hey, we found a guy casting out demons in your name, and he's not one of us, so we told him to stop. And Jesus says, oh, no, don't tell him to stop. It's fine. Well, he obviously had not been given authority to cast out demons, but he's doing it anyway. And so that would indicate that although authority is a relevant factor, it's not the only factor.
This is great. And it's a very rich, nuanced perspective. Thank you for sharing your theological opinion on this, Jimmy, because it's also something else I'd love for you to touch on just very briefly is in this sphere, when we talk about, the authority theory, curses, blaming victims, exploiting, and the holy overload, which I absolutely really appreciate. One of the things you hear in some modern exorcists, and this goes to your authority point, is under the authority structure, there are imprecatory prayers and deprecatory prayers. And if you have direct authority, like you have a child, your son or daughter, you can say as the parent an imprecatory prayer based on your authority. But if it's just a person on the street who you may think might have an issue, you can deprecatorily ask, Holy Mother Mary or the angels or the saints, please help X person. One of the things you did, and listeners will link to this below on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, is when you compared, and this totally changed my mind on things, when you compared the rite of exorcism from the 1600s and the 1999 rite, one of the things that I thought was, oh, well, the 1600s version has way more imprecatory prayers, and the 1998, has no imprecatory prayers, and it's all deprecatory. But and again, this is just for me, cursorily going over it. Can you please just share with the listeners about the differences between imprecatory and deprecatory, and as you say, this holy overload concept and how it all ties together?
So the way the terms are being used in this context, if you're doing what you're referring to as an imprecatory prayer, you're giving a command to the demon. And so you're saying, I command you, get out of this person and don't trouble him anymore. And you may build that up with like, by the way, if you don't, you're going to get judged more harshly on Judgment Day and stuff like that. And I'm telling you this in the name of Christ and things like that. But the core of what you're referring to as an imprecatory prayer is one where you're given a command to the demon. That's not the only way you can do this, though. You also could say, "Oh God," and you're not talking to the demon. You can say, "Oh God, deliver this your servant from the demon that is oppressing him," and so forth. So you're making a request rather than issuing a command. And there have been people, particularly some, not all, but some fans of the 1614 rite who have said, oh, the modern 1998 rite, it doesn't have any imprecatory prayers in it. Yes, it does. And I did an exorcism. Now, unfortunately, the 1998 rite is on a limited circulation basis where, they give it to bishops and the bishops can give it to priests and so forth. But this is also the age of the internet. And if you have good Google foo, you can find it anyway. And I did. So I have an episode of Mysterious World where I say, no, look here's part of one of the imprecatory prayers. And I don't give the full rite. I don't want to put all that information out there, even though others have it, but I do want to put out enough that people will know this is a calumny against the new rite. By the way, another point in favor of my holiness overload is that would explain why saints, live-in saints like Hildegard of Bingen, would be good people to resort to for exorcisms. Because if you've got a live-in saint comes in and says, okay, well, if it's a live-in saint, that's just more holiness you've brought to bear on the problem.
Yes. And again, listeners, to Jimmy's point, check the podcast and video description below because you would love that episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. And Jimmy, we're going to get in just a little bit to your very point about, licit and illicit and previous episodes that you've done on magic and esotericism in the medieval period. But before we get there, as a Catholic theologian, Jimmy, when did you first start thinking systematically about, Western esotericism or ritual magic and its relationship to Catholicism?
I'm glad you included the word systematically because I've been interested in unusual subjects, including magic, going back to being a child, but I hadn't done systematic. I remember going back, this is before the internet. This is before Kindle books. When you had to deal with the library, and I can remember as a kid, going to seeing what books they had on these subjects. And I wasn't even an active Christian at the time, but and I would, even after I became an active Christian, I'd see references to magic, like in the Middle Ages in C.S. Lewis and stuff like that, talking about it from a scholarly perspective, but he never said much about it. When I started systematically looking into the subject, it would be within the last 7 years, because that's how long I've been doing Mysterious World. And after I started Mysterious World, I said, I need to start learning more about the subjects that I'm covering. I don't want to do half-baked episodes. I want to do well-researched episodes. And so I started studying all the different kinds of things that I cover on the show. I started studying, if I hadn't already, I started studying, true crime and UFOs and cryptozoology and parapsychology and exorcism and things like that, ghost stories and things like that, to try to build up a knowledge base in this area that would allow me to comment with more than just, here's my first off-the-cuff opinion that I don't really have a basis for. One of the things I do on the show is I as a discipline, is I look at every mystery we cover from the perspectives of faith and reason. Typically, we do reason first. And we'll say, so what would reason tell us about this mystery? And unlike a lot of mystery-based shows that are just designed to stimulate wonder and imagine, what if this were true? I want to solve the mysteries. So to the extent possible, we use reason to solve the mysteries. We make a list of options. We go down the options and say, what are the pros and cons of each one? And we try to narrow it down as much as possible based on reason. Then we'll say, okay, and what would the Christian faith tell us about this? And I try to be as open-minded as possible and not just presuppose, traditional views on everything. I'm sure you can hear that in my own discussion thus far today, like where instead of just saying, an angel is a created intellect and a demon is a bad angel, I provided all this other context and how the terms can be used in other situations and how they have been used historically. So I'm trying to, think open-mindedly and not just think narrowly. And so I started building up this knowledge base about 7 years ago. And, it takes me a while I can only read so many books at once. But as part of my study of this area, I have read multiple books about magic and multiple books about demonology. And, I watch Justin Sledge's Esoterica channel. I've had him on, and he's gracious on Mysterious World. I plan to have him back, which he's also agreed to do. So I try to delve into this area. I also have another of your guests, Irving Finkel, who wrote The First Ghosts. I've read his book. So I try to study as broadly as I can in these areas.
That's wonderful. And yeah, Dr. Sledge is fantastic, and so is Dr. Finkel. And I love that. I love that you show fidelity to both faith and reason. And you really do, listeners. If you haven't checked out one of Jimmy's episodes before, it is incredibly logical. I mean, very Thomistically modern, if you will, and incredibly well researched, introducing premises and introducing ways that you kind of navigate the topography. That is so wonderful. And I actually, Jimmy, to your point, this actually leads into your last 7 years, and specifically episodes 105 and 106 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, which listeners will link to below. You've done extensive research and extensive work in the area of esotericism and Catholic theologians in the medieval period. And can you share with us a little bit, just some of the broad strokes about, in the medieval period, what were some of the distinctions that Catholic theologians made between licit and illicit magical practices?
Well, I guess we should start by talking about what magic is, because this is a notoriously neuralgic word in anthropology. There are bunches of different definitions for magic that you're going to find in anthropological write-ins, and some of them are based. I won't even go into the whole taxonomy of them, but I'll tell you how I think the most constructive way to use the word magic is. Originally, the term magic, it comes from Greek, but it's based on the name of a Persian tribe, specifically the tribe that we refer to in a lot of English translations of the New Testament as the Magi. And they were a priestly tribe in ancient Mesopotamian religion, kind of like the Jewish tribe of Levi. So, like if you're a Jew, okay, you want to do a sacrifice, you need a priest from the tribe of Levi to do the sacrifice for you, at least after a certain period in their history. Well, if you were one of the Persians, you wanted and you wanted to do a sacrifice, you wanted a member of the tribe of Magi to come and chant the hymn of the gods for you, to make your sacrifice acceptable. And so then the Persians had contact with people in neighboring cultures. And so the term Magia in Greek was developed to mean basically it's the stuff that the Magi do. And originally it was associated strictly with the Persian tribe. But by the 1st century AD, it had come to be used more broadly to mean somebody who does something that reminds us of the Magi, even if it's not literally what the Magi did. And so the term magic from Magia came to mean basically a religious ritual that reminded people of what these foreigners do. So it was an unapproved religious ritual that frequently that was viewed as kind of shady and had often a foreign origin. So, what the Magi did was not in principle, their rituals were not in principle any different than the rituals of people in other religions. Just like the Magi presided at sacrifices, well, Levitical priests provided at sacrifices, and Greco-Roman priests presided at sacrifices, and Egyptian priests presided at sacrifices. But if you were doing something that was kind of, well, we don't do that, that's kind of a foreign thing, we haven't accepted that as an approved ritual here, people would call it magic. And so I think that the most constructive use of the term magic, speaking from an anthropological point of view, is it's just a ritual that is not approved and that has a kind of shady reputation and may well be of foreign origin or include foreign elements, although maybe not. And I've got kind of an interesting illustration of that for you. I hadn't told you I was going to do this, but I have lots of books of magic. Some of them are, electronic, but here I've got a couple. This is Bob Breyer's book on ancient Egyptian magic, which is interesting to read. But this is ancient Christian magic, and it's principally derived from Coptic, which is one of the languages in Egypt, because just like this other one, you notice they're both magic books, but they're both focused on Egypt. It's because Egypt has a very dry climate, and so papyrus survives better in Egypt than it does in, say, Germany. And so we have lots of ancient literature from Egypt compared to other countries, and that makes these glimpses into ancient magic more accessible from Egypt than, say, Germany or Iceland or somewhere like that. So this is a collection of rituals, this ancient Christian magic book. It's a collection of rituals that come from Egypt, and they are classified by the editors, Marvin Meyer and Richard Smith, as being magic. And they cover all kinds of interesting stuff. Now, I don't myself read magical books for purposes of practicing magic. I have them for purposes of understanding how did people think about this, what did they do, what were the kinds of things they did, and so forth. So in going through ancient Christian magic, there are quite a number of very interesting rituals or spells in here. And some of my favorites are... Let's see. Spell for a good singing voice. So you want to be a good singer? Here's a ritual for you. Or another spell for a good singing voice. So apparently having a good singing voice was a high desirability. They got more than one ritual for it. And then spell to bind or silence a dog.
My goodness.
It's like, you want that dog next door to shut up? Here's a ritual for you. But when you turn to the rituals in question and you read them, they're fascinating. I was really struck. Now, a lot of these rituals are from early centuries of the Christian era. And in reading these, it's like, wow, the people who wrote some of these were really well informed theologically. I mean, they're dealing with complex theological concepts. But just to stick with the first spell for a good singing voice, and, spell, that's added by the translators. They didn't call them spells, but it's a ritual. So here's what you do. Here's the part you say. This is the invocation. You say, "One Holy Father, amen. One Holy Son, amen. One Holy Spirit, amen." Okay, they just invoked the Trinity. Jesus, amen. Savior, amen. Sabaoth, amen. Sabaoth being a Hebrew word that is connected with God. "I invoke you. Hear me in your mercy, O you who are the true God, God of the lights, God of heaven and earth, Lord God Almighty, Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the one before whom stand the cherubim and the seraphim, before whom everyone trembles, singing to him, praising him, and saying, Holy, 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 Lord Sabaoth. Heaven and earth are full of your glory. Truly indeed, God Almighty, heaven and earth are full of your glory." Okay, is this sounding particularly magical to you thus far, or does it just sound like an ordinary Christian prayer?
Yes, deep ladder. Yeah.
Yeah. And I say many of these same lines at Mass every Sunday. We've got the Trisagion, the Holy, Holy, Holy. That's part of the Catholic Mass. So you've just invoked God with all this pretty standard sounding Christian prayer. Then you say, "Hear me today. I am the son of name." So in my case, it would be, I am the son of Susan, or I'm the son of Jim, or whatever. "I invite you down upon this wine and this honey that is mixed with water." So you made as part of this ritual, you took wine and honey and water and mixed it all up in a cup. So I invite you down upon this wine and this honey that is mixed with water in this chalice that is before me, so that you might bless it with the blessing from heaven above, your holy dwelling place. And it might become for me a strong breath and a most superior voice, and sweet as wild honey. And let my tongue be straight. Let it sing beautifully in the presence of men and women and children, all together by your holy and great name. And it goes on from there. But basically, you want your voice to sound good, so you make up, this drink of wine and honey and water, and you ask God to bless it and improve your singing voice. Okay, what's unacceptable here? This is one of those things where I think it's classified by these editors as magic. But to me, this looks like, okay, this is just a blessing. It's a ritual that's used for blessing. And here's what I have also, the current official book of blessings from the Catholic Church. This is used in Latin Christianity. And it's got blessings, some of which involve your throat. For example, on February 3rd, which is the Feast of St. Blaise, there is the Order of the Blessing of Throats on the Feast of St. Blaise. And this one can even be done by lay people. As part of what you do, so St. Blaise was a guy who his head was cut off, and he's become a patron of problems with your throat. As a result, people have turned to St. Blaise to help with problems with the throat. And so what you do in this blessing is you take a pair of candles and you make the sign of the cross with them. So you have the Christian symbol of the cross. Then you put that intersection of the two candles over your throat, or someone else is doing this, but they put that intersection so you're applying the cross made out of candles to the person's throat. And then the person given the blessing says, through the intercession of St. Blaise, bishop and martyr, may God deliver you from every disease of the throat and from every other illness, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And then you who are receiving the blessing, you say amen. Okay, now this is to deliver you from throat problems, one of which could, I guess, be having a bad singing voice, whereas this other ritual is specifically honing in on the bad singing voice problem. But the difference just seems to be the approval level that the two rituals have. The St. Blaise blessing for your throat, which uses candles instead of a drink, is currently approved in the Latin Rite of the Church. And I don't know what the status was of the ritual for a good singing voice. I don't know what ancient Egyptian bishops thought of it. They may have approved it. I may have just read to you from an ancient ritual that was just as approved as the ones we have now. But there doesn't seem to be anything intrinsically objectionable in what I read. It's just a different way of approaching God and performing a ritual action and asking for his help. So I think that the key difference between magic and approved ritual is just the approval. Now, there can be reasons that a ritual doesn't get approved. Like if for example, if you took the current Rite of St. Blaise, and instead of asking for deliverance from throat problems through the intercession of St. Blaise, you just edited the text and said through the intercession of Satan, well, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't get approval on that. So there can be reasons that a ritual doesn't get approved. But I think that the fundamental distinguishing mark between magic and other ritual is that the magic just doesn't have approval of the local competent authorities. And then you can say, well, then why doesn't it? And maybe there's a good reason, or maybe the practice is more acceptable than you think.
Jimmy, this is great. I am very much looking forward to checking out both of those tomes. I've looked at a few excerpts on the Book of Blessings. The Ancient Christian Magic looks fascinating. And to your point, let me see if this makes sense too. When you were talking earlier about authority, also one of the big differences, and tell me if this is accurate, is in the medieval grimoires, there's also a lot of imprecator. So there's, adjuro vos, exorcizo vos, invoke o vos. I invoke you, I exorcise you. But here in ancient Christian magic, it's the opposite. It's more deep. It's calling upon the Trinity, not because you have an authority of command, but you're saying, "Oh, Saint Blaise, oh, Holy Trinity," in a deprecatory manner. Please bless the throat. Please, would that be somewhat fair? Of a distinction?
It is a distinction, but I don't know that it's, I wouldn't consider it to tell us which is magic versus which is not.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think that's based on approval. And you can have both command and request-based formulae in both magic and in approved ritual.
That's fascinating. And actually, Jimmy, this very topic that you brought up about the nuances, something that I know you take, you put a lot of effort into on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World about the nuances and looking at the context of things. To that very point, one of St. Thomas Aquinas's teachers, St. Albert the Great, or Albertus Magnus. Oh, yeah, please.
Actually, before I forget, but that's an illustration of how I try to take an open-minded approach. If I were just coming in and condemning, I would see the word magic on the cover of the book and say, oh, it's got to be bad. But no, actually, you look at it, it doesn't look so bad.
Yeah, I mean, pure Trinitarian formula, pure just invoking a saint or calling upon a saint to ask them to do something via their intercession. To me, that seems like, straight up Christianity, straight up Catholicism. So thank you for that nuanced approach. And also, I think this goes, listeners, something we said at the beginning about your spirit of charity, Jimmy, and also being able to really nuance things. And so thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. And this goes to an exact medieval example of this, which is many listeners, of course, are familiar with St. Thomas Aquinas, but one of St. Thomas's mentors or teachers, Albertus Magnus, also known as St. Albert the Great, explored the nuance between these boundaries between, licit and illicit magic and defending the magi or the wise men who followed a star to the nativity of Christ in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 2. And specifically, St. Albert's quote, and this is from the Routledge History of Medieval Magic, saying when St. Albert was looking at this, his quote, attempt to exclude demonic aid from the wise men's undertaking to identify their interpretations of biblical revelation as rational and to distinguish from their ways of coming to knowledge of any hint of demonic aid. Albert's commentary on Matthew 2 reflects a mode of biblical exegesis and an approach to astrology that can be considered scholastic, end quote. And so, Jimmy, given this, I was blown away when I heard this. Can you share your own theological opinion on St. Albert's analysis of Matthew 2 and following the star?
Well, I can up to a point.
Okay.
I have the Routledge History of Magic, but they don't give me the quotation from not the full quotation with its context from Albert the Great. And this is a perennial problem with Albert the Great, who is also, like Thomas Aquinas, he's also, and Hildegard of Bingen, he's also a doctor of the church, which means he's one of the top, 36 theologians in church history. And he's one of them. They don't call you the great unless you got something going on. And so I would love, and I know of things that he wrote about because I read references to them in scholarly works. But it is very hard to find English translations, and my Latin is not such that I can read it as easily as English. I can read it, but it's like, I get it's a big process, especially if I want to translate accurately. So, I would even pay Brill publishers hundreds of dollars to give me accurate translations of Albert the Great. And for people who may not know, Brill, the price of Brill books is insane. Justin Sledge and I have joked about this. I think I asked him a question when he was on Mysterious World about, what is the center of evil in academic publishing and why is it Brill? Because they make it so hard to afford their books. Like, for example, here is Babylonian Planetary Omens Volume 4, published by Brill. I paid $300 for this book, and you can see how thin it is. I am thoroughly convinced that when the publishers of Brill, they're based in the Netherlands, by the way, although this has nothing to do with that. But once they are all dead and justly in Tartarus, they are going to experience a situation where, I mean, it could be purgatory, but they're going to experience a Tantalus-like afterlife where they are in a big pool of water and there are all these, gourds just out of their reach that have the sum total of human knowledge in them. But in order to reach for one particular gourd that has the knowledge they want, they're going to have to pay a ridiculous price.
That's great.
So that's their afterlife. In any event, when it comes, so I don't have Albert the Great's discussion of, I have the Rutledge, history of magic, but I don't have exactly what Albert the Great said. So with that as a proviso, there were attempts to integrate astrology within a Christian framework. Now, the big problem that a lot of early Christians recognized immediately with astrology is the way it was frequently taught in Greek circles was that it was that what the stars were doing, it had this enormous influence on what was happening down here on Earth, and that it was all a matter of fate. The fates determined what was going to happen, and as a result of that, you didn't have free will. So astrology was frequently understood as you are completely subject to the fates through the stars, and there is no free will. And that was a problem both for Jews and for Christians. So in a Christian, both of them later found ways to incorporate this because it's obvious the stars do have an influence, especially the big one that comes up every day and controls things like our agricultural cycle and how hot it is or cold it is and stuff like that. So obviously there are heavenly influences on Earth. It's just a question about which ones and how much. Even modern astrological skeptics are going to say, well, Jupiter does have this little tiny tug on. Okay, that's an influence. So we're not debating are there influences, but which influences and how much. And actually, even on a purely, anti-astrology perspective, there are some findings of modern science that look suspiciously like astrology. I mean, your birth sign, I don't know what sign you are, but your birth sign is associated with various physical and mental outcomes. People born in certain star signs have higher rates of mental illness or higher rates of educational achievement or higher rates of physical stature that they grow to. And this is all purely natural. And one of the ways we know that is they're reversed in the Southern Hemisphere. And it turns out what's happening is if you were in the womb during the summer months, your mom got more vitamin D from the longer daylight. And that vitamin D caused you to get an early start or lack of an early start on certain characteristics that are going to manifest years down the line, like how tall you're going to be, how much schooling you're going to get, or how prone to mental illness you are. So there can even, and I talk about this on The Serious World, so, there can even be influences that pop up in surprising ways, and that will satisfy even a skeptic. There have been medical journal articles published about these things, and I cite them. So we don't want to rashly dismiss astrology. On the other hand, that doesn't mean it doesn't have big problems with it too. And we'll get to that. But the early Christians and Jews made a parallel move, at least when it came to Israel. They said, they had a saying, there is no mazel, or there's no star for Israel. It's like the stars may rule the Gentiles, but God is ruling us. Well, Christians had a parallel move. They said, you can admit that there's influence from the stars as long as you preserve free will. And so what medievals like St. Thomas Aquinas did was they looked at phenomena and said, to what extent might the stars have an influence on this? So Aquinas, for example, and I know I'm not talking about Albertus yet, but I'll get to him. But his student, Aquinas, said that, okay, well, let's look at the weather. Does the weather involve free will? No. Therefore, astrologers could forecast storms and things like that, at least as far as he knew, given the science of his day. You know, there's no free will involved in a storm. It's just stuff going on in the atmospheric movement and stuff. And yeah, okay, the stars could control that. Or earthquakes, you know, or forest fires or things like that, unless a human said it. What about what people do? Well, okay, humans do have free will, but that doesn't mean they always follow it. Much of the time, they're just following their passions. And so if people have a particular passion, like let's say there's let's say America becomes really regionally divided. Now this happened 160 years ago between the North and the South, but let's just change it around. Let's say the people in the East and the West really start hating each other. So you have all this popular sentiment against those evil Easterners or evil Westerners, and we're heading towards a new civil war. Well, okay, what would Aquinas say about that? Well, even though there can be, you know, people who are gonna resist their passions, most people won't. And so astrologers have a pretty good, he thinks, ability to predict what large-scale movements of people are going to do, because most of the people are going to follow their instincts rather than higher enlightened reasons. Now, it's not perfect, because you may have some who do listen to the better angels of their nature and help settle stuff down. I'm not going to get into too much more of that because it'll get too complex. But he would say, even with a single individual, you know, if let's say they have an irascible temper, meaning they get mad easy, well, you could use astrology to predict what they're likely to do unless they exercise the free will to resist their passions. So you could have a kind of probabilistic prediction, but it's not going to be infallible. So that was how Aquinas looked at astrology. And that's one of the reasons why astrology continued to be one of the quadrivium, which was the standard. There were sort of two levels of classical education, liberal arts education, that had 7 skills you learned in them, and the lower level, which was a set of 4, it was known as the quadrivium. One of them was astrology, which was lumped at the same time together with astronomy, because they weren't distinguished yet. And so that's how Aquinas looked at it. Now, I don't know what his teacher, Albert the Great, said, but I would suspect it's probably similar. My guess is that Newton's apple didn't fall too far from the tree on this occasion. So if Albert the Great is looking at the Magi who visit Jesus, and it's like, okay, well, they weren't talking to demons. They made a prediction from the stars based on something that could be inferred, maybe about God's plan, you know, which, well, okay, the stars are under God's control. He could program the stars to have a role in this revolution in world affairs that accompanied the birth of Christ. And there are ways that you could harmonize what happened with the Magi in a way that didn't involve a violation of Christian principles. Exactly how Albert the Great did that, I don't know. But it's a fascinating subject, and I find the Star of Bethlehem fascinating in and of itself. I think there's been a lot of, and I've done episodes about it. I think that there's been a lot of bad speculation about the Star of Bethlehem for a few reasons. One of them, this is just getting into my personal opinion, but a lot of people are using the wrong birth date for Christ. And that leads them to identify the wrong phenomena in the sky as the Star of Bethlehem. I'm a biblical chronology geek, and the common dates that you hear for when Christ was born are off by a year or two. And so once you identify the correct time frame of reference, that puts you in a better position to say what might the star have been. And a lot of people have bad speculation anyway, like, oh, it was a supernova. Well, if it was a supernova, it wouldn't have any meaning in any astrological system of the day because it's a new star. So it has no established meaning. So that's a bad idea. Or, oh, it was a meteor. Except meteors last for seconds. They don't last long enough to be the Star of Bethlehem. Or, oh, it was a comet, except comets were basically universally interpreted as bad omens. Other people using the wrong birthday for Jesus have also tried to interpret it in terms of Greek mythology, Greek astrology. But maybe you know the answer to this, Alex. Is Greece to the west or the east of Jerusalem?
Greece is to the west of Jerusalem.
Yeah, and where did the wise men come from? Was that the east or the west?
Yes, the wise men came from the east.
Yeah, so we shouldn't be looking to Greek astrology to tell us what they were seeing and how they would have interpreted it. That's why I spent $300 to get Babylonian planetary omens, because it is it deals with a relevant astrological system from this part of the world. And they had, there's just so much stuff that's interesting. Now, this is volume 4, which is all the omens about Jupiter. And I think that's what the Star of Bethlehem was. I think they saw Jupiter do something in the sky that told them a king is going to be born in a place they called Amuru, which was the area to the west of Babylon, but that bordered the Mediterranean Sea, which the Jewish state did. There's going to be a king born there who can help us out, because they had certain omens connected with Jupiter. And there's some very interesting stuff about this. I won't go through it all because it would take too much time. But we don't know for sure that they were using Babylonian astrology. But if they were, there is a plausible scenario for something that Jupiter did in the correct time frame that would suggest to a Babylonian astrologer, maybe you want to go over to Jerusalem and establish a peace envoy because there's a new king who's from there who is going to potentially help you out. And I think that's the most likely scenario for what the Magi saw. They have all kinds of fun stuff, though, in Babylonian astrology. The way they did it, it's not like us, where we'll calculate where the planets were or are going to be. They would wait until a planet did something in the sky. That's why this is planetary omens. You're looking up at the sky to give you omens, and then you look back and say, okay, the last time this strange thing happened, what happened? And one of the things they have with Jupiter is if it appears in the sky under certain conditions, it means the king is going to die. And so how do we protect the king if Jupiter says he's going to die? And they had what is now called the substitute king ritual. So what they would do is they would go to the prison and they would find someone who was already condemned to death, and they would bring him out of prison, and they would dress him up as the king, and they would feast him like they would feast a king, and they would refer to him as the king. So we're telling the cosmos, this guy here, he's the king. Meanwhile, the former king gets to spend a month as the farmer. And he dresses like a farmer, and he lives in a farmer's house, and he backs off for a month, and everyone talks about him as the farmer to tell the cosmos and the gods, okay, this other guy, he's not the king. He's just a farmer. And then when at the time that Jupiter dictates the king should die, you take the current king, the substitute, and you just execute him because you were going to do that anyway. And then the farmer can come back to the palace and put on the royal robes, and he's safe. And that's the substitute king ritual. So there's some fascinating stuff in this area.
Oh my goodness. I know I've never heard of something like the king substitution ritual. And Jimmy, thank you for literally, and this is something that's so great that you do, and Justin Sledge and everyone, for for getting these beautiful gems from the very hard to get Brill literature. This is so great. And I really appreciate you sharing all of that, especially the history, the context, and how people like St. Thomas Aquinas looked at something and how it could be applied today, as well as Albertus Magnus. And I think, Jimmy, given that, this tees up the next question perfectly, because, okay, we have, in the 1300s, we have, St. Thomas Aquinas, we have Albertus Magnus. And then if we go all the way to today and the Catechism of the Catholic Church, can you share about, and I believe it's paragraph 2117, but I know you will correct me if I'm off on that. Can you share about the key things that you want listeners to know from a theological view regarding what the Catechism says in paragraph 2117, where it says, quote, all practices of magic or sorcery by which one attempts to tame occult powers so as to place them at one's service and have a supernatural power over others, even if this were for the sake of restoring their health, are gravely contrary to the virtue of religion, end quote. So how can you elaborate on that? And how does that square with exactly what you were talking about with St. Thomas?
Yeah. So one of the things that people have to understand about the catechism is that it's catechism, and catechisms are not designed to answer every question you might ask. Catechisms are designed to provide basic instruction in the faith. And so in looking at the catechism, like one of the things I wish it did was give us a definition of magic. And it doesn't. It's assuming you know what magic is, but it's not stopping to develop a definition. And that means that it leaves questions unanswered that would be answered different ways depending on how you define magic. So I think that in reading what the catechism says here, like in other similar passages that are commenting just very briefly on various phenomena, you have to look at it and say, what's it trying to address? And it says all practices of magic or sorcery by which one attempts to tame occult powers. Now, okay, so that's the first thing, is we're trying to tame a hidden or occult power of some kind. What might that be? Well, it might be a hidden aspect of nature that nobody has discovered, but it's hard to see why, like if we didn't used to know about gravity or electromagnetism or the strong and weak nuclear forces. Those are all forces in nature that have been discovered by scientists in recent centuries, or even in the most recent century. But the church doesn't have any problem with science discovering new natural forces. So I don't think that the hidden powers this paragraph is talking about deal with natural forces. And it's some other kind of hidden power, like hidden angels and getting to tame them. So I think that's the kind of power it's talking about. All practices of magic or sorcery by which one attempts to tame occult powers so as to place them at one's service and have a supernatural power over others, even if you're trying to help them out by restoring their health, are gravely contrary to the practice of the virtue of religion. Okay, so what's the virtue of religion? Well, it's basically having a right relationship with God and so forth. And so if I am now, also, I think we can bring in my definition here, even though the Catechism doesn't limit us to this, of magic as an unapproved ritual. But if someone says, okay, I've got this unapproved ritual, and I'm going to try to tame either God or his angels or his demons and place them at my service and have a supernatural influence over other humans, even if I'm trying to do something nice for them, do I have a right relationship with God at that point? It would seem to me no. And so this is not going to be consistent with the virtue, it's going to be contrary to the virtue of religion. That's not to say I can't invoke God, but I can't command him around. And it's not to say I can't ask angels for their help, but it is to say I can't just force them to obey me. And I, by manipulating God or manipulating his angels, should not be trying to have a supernatural power over other human beings. That I should be leaving the supernatural stuff up to God. And I may ask God, could you do this, please? But I shouldn't be trying to assume control myself. And so I would say, yeah, you shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. And those would all be reasons why it would be just, I would say, for a bishop to not approve this ritual.
That's a wonderful piece of context, Jimmy, and it leads right into something that is, I believe in the Catechism as well, is can you share about then, someone might say, okay, I've heard some theologians talk about people who are interested in the occult sciences or looking at, grimoire traditionalism, evocatory procedures. Can you share about what is the sin, if you will, of curiosity in Catholicism? And then is there anything to balance that out, like maybe a virtue of studiousness or anything you can share on that?
Yeah, so you've obviously done some reading in this area because studiousness is the counterbalance to curiosity in medieval literature. I haven't verified this for 100%, but the impression I get from the reading I've done is that curiousness and so in English, in contemporary English, this is all changed. We almost never hear the word studiousness used, and we hear the word curiosity used all the time. My impression is that in medieval Latin, they were more balanced, and they would use studiousness to refer to a good acquisition of knowledge and curiosity to use in reference to a bad acquisition of knowledge. The problem is not wanting to get knowledge. That's a good thing. And so if you read, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas on this subject, and by the way, I should note, I am not personally a Thomist, but his writings are widely available and Orthodox and in English, so he's a good reference point. He's also a doctor of the church. But if you look at his, I'll just give the reference really quickly for those who want to look it up. It's the second part of the Summa. It's question 167, Article 1. Can the vice of curiosity regard intellective knowledge? And you'll notice he's referred to it, or it's referred to in this translation as the vice of curiosity, suggesting it's a bad thing. He answers by saying, as stated above, and this is in the previous question, studiousness is directly not about knowledge itself, but about a desire and study in the pursuit of knowledge. Now, we must judge differently of the knowledge itself of truth, and he goes on, but basically what he does is he distinguishes studiousness and curiosity not in reference to are you trying to get knowledge, but what are the consequences of that? And so an example he gives is if you want to learn stuff so you can have an inflated sense of self-importance and pride, well, okay, that's curiosity, that you're doing something bad. Or if you want to learn something like how to pick a safe so you can go out and steal money from people, okay, that's curiosity too. That's bad. If you want to learn spells so that you can bend God to your will, okay, that's bad. And basically, he defines curiosity in such a way as it's the pursuit of knowledge that is disordered somehow so that it leads to something bad, as opposed to, I just want to know because knowledge is cool. Okay, that's studiousness. Now, there are some ways that even the scenario I just named could result in curiosity rather than studiousness. For example, let's suppose I'm a Catholic apologist and I need to study up on, some subject because it's going to become relevant. Let's say I have a debate next week. If I cast myself back in time a week, this would be true. But let's suppose I've got a debate coming up next week with an atheist on the resurrection of Jesus. And so I need to study up on the resurrection of Jesus just to refresh my memory of all the points I may want to make. Okay. Well, if I said, hey, abstract mathematics is cool, I'm going to spend all week studying abstract mathematics instead of the resurrection. Well, okay, that would lead to something bad because I'm not doing what I should right now. And so that would be curiosity rather than studiousness. But basically, if it's a pursuit of knowledge that causes some kind of a problem, whether it's a moral problem like pride, or whether it's a practical problem like I don't know what I'm supposed to say about the resurrection now because I goofed off doing math all last week, it's going to be classified as curiosity. But as long as there's no problem, yeah, knowledge is a good thing. Knock yourself out. Be as studious as you want.
That's fantastic. So really, it comes down to, as you cited St. Thomas and as your theological opinion, it's really about looking at the consequences. What are the results of what I'm doing regarding what I'm studying, how I'm studying it? What effect will that have? Like with the debate.
Okay. And there can be bad effects, for example, just to cite an obvious one, and this would be another moral fault. Okay. Let's watch child pornography because we're curious about it. Okay. That's going to feed some disordered desires. You should not be doing that. So that would be an example of curiosity rather than studiousness. Similarly, you could say, like, I've got these books here on ancient. Let's pick the ancient Egyptian magic, since I'm not an ancient Egyptian. For me, this is definitely unapproved ritual. Okay, well, if I want to read about ancient Egyptian rituals, so I can worship the god Thoth, and who was one of their gods of magic, and then actually put it into practice. Well, okay, that's not appropriate for me coming from a Christian perspective. But if I just want to understand ancient Egyptians because I have a curiosity about Egyptology, I want to know, what did they believe? What did they do? What did they think about the way the world worked and the role of magic in it? Well, okay, then that I can study that. Or if I need, as a Catholic apologist, if I need to interact with people who are trying to revive ancient Egyptian religion, I could need to study it for that reason. So, it's not so much the knowledge itself, it's why are you studying it, and is there a good purpose, or are there bad consequences from doing that?
That's excellent context. Thank you, Jimmy. And, specifically regarding the history that you were just diving into about, we don't really hear studiousness anymore. And if you look at the scholastics and the medieval period, it was a little bit more balanced. This next question goes to someone who we were discussing as well. And a term that I was telling you, my ears perked up when I first heard you mention it a couple of years ago, is you've spoken before about something many listeners are familiar with on the podcast, the medieval clerical underworld. That has been referenced by Dr. Richard Kickheffer in his seminal 1998 book, Forbidden Rites. It's an excellent transcription and analysis of CLM 849, the Munich manual that I know many listeners are familiar with. But in that tome, in the 1998 book, Richard Kickheffer says, quote, clerics in the medieval times were disproportionately represented in necromantic rites, using Latin texts and presupposing knowledge of mainstream ritual. The beliefs and ritual operations found in necromancy mimic those of established rites, somewhat as the threads are the same on both sides of a tapestry, and the patterns they form on the underside are recognizably related to those on the front, end quote. And so, Jimmy, I know you've spoken about this before, but can you give us the broad strokes on, do you agree with Dr. Kickheffer that ritual magic like that is a reverse tapestry of established Catholic rites, or how do you see that overall?
Well, I think there's a balance to be struck here. And I think Kickheffer has done a lot of really great work in this area. And I don't know that he says, I've read this quote in the original, I don't know that he presents it as an absolute. I definitely agree there was a medieval clerical underworld, and that clerics who were not all priests, this also includes the preliminary stages, like I mentioned earlier, exorcist was one of those. It was a stage you went through on your way to being ordained as a priest. And some people got part way to being a priest, but they never finished. They never went all the way. But anybody who was in the process, even if they stalled out at a certain point, anybody who was in the process was called a cleric. And they were disproportionately represented in certain segments of magical use. Now, there were other people who were not clerics that also were disproportionately represented, like, folk healers, like wise women and stuff like that, or wise guys, if you want to do the other sex. And so there were a lot of folk practitioners, but in terms of people who were doing certain types of magic, yes, they tended to be, especially magic in Latin, who had books of magic and stuff, as opposed to just folk rituals they did. It did tend to be clerics. One reason for that is you needed to read. You also needed to be able to buy books or manuscripts at least. And so, who could read Latin in the Middle Ages? Well, clerics could. And who could have libraries and who made books? It's like you got a scriptorium going in your monastery. Yeah, okay. So you have access and ability, and you're going to have clerics being disproportionately represented. So all that's true. Also, you're going to have similarities between ceremonial magic or ritual magic and Christian ritual, because if you've got clerics doing this, well, they're going to relate it to other rituals they do. And so, if they're used to going to mass and they see this thing done and it's like, oh, wow, that sounds impressive. I wonder if I should incorporate that into a ritual I'm doing outside of Mass, like invoking the Trinity or invoking the holy name of all the different titles of Jesus to get my will done in this context outside of Mass. Well, yeah, okay, let's do that. And this is a point that Kickheffer explores, and by the way, I'm going to do at least one episode. I've got a whole series of planned episodes that will relate to the medieval clerical necromantic underworld, and it's another on its modern equivalent, because there's a modern equivalent to it too. But I'm going to have at least one on the medieval clerical necromantic underground. It shares all these elements with medieval exorcistic practice. And so I think of these in terms of stages of medieval clerical necromancy. Stage one occurs when you're doing an exorcism. So you're trying to get the demon out. And as you're doing that, maybe the demon's trying to bargain with you and he wants to stay in the person. And so it's like, did you know that here are the hot stocks next week that you could invest in? So he's given you hidden information, occult information, and you believe it. Now, what the 1614 rite of exorcism says is ignore anything a demon says like that. It says, do not, the only thing you ever listen to a demon about is stuff directly relevant to getting it out of the person. You ignore everything else. But, put yourself in the position of a medieval exorcist, and the 1614 rite isn't around yet. And the demon is telling me what the stock market is going to do next week, and I could use that information. Okay, that's stage 1, clerical necromancy, or type 1. Clerical necromancy, where you're doing an exorcism, the demon gives you occult information, hidden information, and you believe it. Or you don't just ignore it. Okay, so that's type 1, clerical necromancy. Type 2 goes like this. You say, I was getting rid of that demon the other day, and he gave me this this hidden information. Occult just means hidden. He gave me this hidden information, and that was really cool, but wow, it was too bad somebody had to get possessed. So how about I summon up the demon and I use the power of Jesus Christ to get it to tell me the hidden information. And I use the name of Jesus to control it, and this will be great. I'll get the hidden information. God will get glory because I'm subjecting the demon to God in the name of Christ. That brings God glory, and nobody has to get possessed. And so type 2, clerical necromancy, is outside of the context of an exorcism. You get hidden information from the demon. Then there's type 3. Type 3 clerical necromancy is, all that hidden information that I got from the demon, that was really good, but I have some other stuff that I need done. Like I've got this enemy and I just really need his crops blighted. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to call up the demon, and I'm going to use the name of God and all the angels and saints, and I'm going to force that demon to go blight the crops of my enemy so that justice will be restored in the world. And that'll be good for me, and that'll bring glory to God, and nobody has to get possessed. And so type 3 clerical necromancy is outside of the context of an exorcism. You use the demon to do stuff besides just give you information. Now, so you can see how exorcism would lead to ceremonial magic involving demons. And I even have a proposal, and I haven't ever discussed this with Richard Kickheffer, but I have a theory that I'd be interested in his perspective on now I've called these type 1, type 2, and type 3, but I wonder if historically they could be stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. So that first you had a bunch of exorcists who had doing exorcisms, and the demons are spouting off this interest in hidden information. And then later they get the idea of, hey, maybe we can get the hidden information without anyone having to get possessed. And then later they get the idea of maybe we could have these demons doing other stuff for us besides just giving us the hidden information. And so I would be interested to know to what degree. Now, any historical process is messy, and it's not going to be a simple 1, 2, 3 across the board historically. But I would be interested to find out what evidence do we have that some people may have followed that trajectory between starting with the safe stuff of, I just want to get rid of this demon, and then they get tempted to, and I like this hidden information, to, let's maybe do it without the possessed person, and so forth. So I would not be at all surprised to learn that at least some people in the clerical necromantic underworld had this happen in this kind of sequence. In any event, that's a theory, but you can see how, whether you buy the stage theory or just the type theory, this is going to lead to the development of rituals that are kind of a reverse tapestry of established Catholic rites. But I said there needs to be balance here, and there have been some Christian authors, including some in the Church Fathers, who I think overestimated the degree to which non-Christian rites mirrored Christian rites. And they would say, oh yeah, the demons went out there ahead of Christianity and they invented all these rites that are like satanic parodies of what Christians do. And they seeded them in these other cultures. And it's like, okay, well, maybe that happened, but maybe it's just independent origination of something similar. You know, or, you know, who can really say for sure, you know, if we're talking about the hidden world anyway. So I want to display some caution on that regard and not just say that these kind of necromantic rites are all just a parody of what Christians are doing. But I think there are plausible connections between some Christian practice, particularly in exorcism, and some necromantic practice. I think Kickheffer's definitely right about that, but I have not seen him advance a kind of absolute position of it's all derived from this. And I suspect he, being a scholar, he would say, yeah, I don't think it's all derived from this, but there are some elements where it is kind of like this. They do seem to be mirror images in certain areas in some respects.
That is fascinating, Jimmy. And I would hope that, if you know, you and Dr. Kickheffer ever connect, or if Dr. Kickheffer shares his, that is a wonderful and fascinating thing about stages, you know, and how those all interact. Very briefly, I can kind of trace out something that we talk about on the show a lot regarding the work that scholars have done on tracing the techniques of ritual magic. Dr. Stephen Skinner and Dr. Kickheffer and others, but roughly in 20 seconds, it would basically be that 2,000 years ago, and I love your Christian magic book as well. I'm definitely going to check that out. You have initial techniques that are really first found in, quote unquote, the Western tradition in the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, which was a distinct form of magic compared to dynastic Egyptian magic, which was earlier, but around like 100 AD or the year 0, effectively the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri days, certain techniques were seen. Like it was a little bit more rare in the PGM, but a consecrated circle, the wearing of a protective phylactery, the intonation of nomina magica or divine names. And I'm going to trace this out, but I'm curious what you think about how this fits into your perspective there, because I think you made a great point. These techniques migrate, say 1,000 years later, up to the Byzantine Empire. And so you have like the hygromantia or the hygromantia, you have specific works there where the Greek clergy, Orthodox clergy, were exactly engaged in that. That's a fascinating thing to think about, the Greek clerical underworld. And then as Constantinople was falling, you have this migration of manuscripts over to, you know, Rome and Italy, and then through Western Europe, but also on the Western side with Alfonso X and the court of Castile. And you have this other movement of Arabic manuscripts. So if you're a monk in the year 1350 or 1400 in Germany or in England, Spain, Europe is getting effectively flooded from both the southwest and from the east of magical material, Jewish, Greek, and Arabic. So I guess the question for you would be, does that kind of fit what you were just saying, which is if you're a cleric, you had to wrestle with these things and you're getting all new information in. So it's like, what do you do? How do you process that? Would any of that fit into your stage theory as well? Yeah.
Yeah. Both in terms of the stages, which I admit is going to be a messy process. Some people are going to go straight to type 3. They're not going to care about type 1 or type 2. But I suspect that overall, it may have developed in stages to a significant degree. But in terms of incorporating various things, well, the foreign and the unapproved are exotic. And people are going to attribute significance to things they find exotic. So, hey, I may not be a Mussulman, but wow, they've got some interesting rituals they do. Maybe I can incorporate some of what they do and some of what I do. So, So I could see how Islamic ritual could have an influence on European ritual. Similarly, hey, those ancient Greeks, I mean, they're an interesting bunch. Some of them predicted Christ, and they're where our culture came from anyway. And there was all this stuff that got lost, and now we're finding it and translating it. And like those manuscripts we got from the Arabs and stuff. Maybe we can incorporate some of this, or our Jewish buddies. Oh, this Zohar thing, that sounds interesting. Maybe we can incorporate some of that. So yeah, if you're doing sort of frontier work, there's a school of thought in this. It's actually common in conservative Protestantism, but before I was Catholic, I used to be conservative Presbyterian. And in conservative Presbyterianism, there's a school of thought known as theonomy. That it's a very interesting school. I won't go into it in detail, but one of the criticisms I heard once of theonomy is that it's like doing frontier theology as if you were in downtown Philadelphia, because they'd make these really radical proposals, but treat them as this is totally obvious. And I think there's something similar here where, if you're doing Orthodox theology, okay, that puts some safety guardrails on. But if you're doing frontier theology, if you're doing unapproved, shady, foreign sounding stuff, you're going to be a little more eclectic.
That is again, listeners, I hope you appreciate that as much as I do. That's a wonderful element to think about as we think about the history of Western magic and the relationship to approved theological practices and ritualistic rites. That's Jimmy. Thank you for sharing that. In addition, and this actually goes, because you were just speaking about your background as well. We have a lot of listener questions for you from some of the patrons, and one of them is from Marco. And Marco is asking, and I believe this might relate to if you've ever experienced yourself any supernatural activity. But Marco's saying, Jimmy, what needed to happen for you to fully accept that it's not just in your head?
Well, it would help if I knew what the referent for the pronoun it was, for it's not just in your head. If he means to, because I could answer that a number of ways. I already had, I've all my life have had a predisposition towards away from skeptical materialism. I've always had an interest in religion, even before I was Christian, and an openness to a worldview that goes beyond simple materialism. In terms of what convinced me of that, I had an intellectual conversion to Christianity when I was 20, and that conversion was not super intellectual at the time. I'm an intellectual person, but this conversion was not super intellectual, but it became intellectual with time. And I started studying apologetics, which is what I do professionally. And so I realized, there are rational arguments for a supernatural worldview. And I was convinced by, for example, the arguments for the existence of God and the resurrection of Jesus, that, okay, I think, Christianity is true. And I got married, and I was married for 4 years, and then my wife died at the age of 27. And as she was dying, there were some coincidences that happened that I won't describe in detail here, not because they're private, just because it would take extra time. But, and we've already been going for 2 hours. But based on what I know now, they would be classified in Jungian psychology as synchronicities. And they were very profound synchronicities that went well beyond random chance. And so that provided a kind of experiential dimension that went beyond the intellectual learning I'd had. Then, beginning less than 7 years ago, when I started Mysterious World, I started studying not just religious questions, but also parapsychology. And I'm actually, depending on whose criteria you want to use, I'm a parapsychologist. I mean, I publish scientific articles on parapsychology in peer-reviewed journals. I teach parapsychology for the Rhine Institute. I am scheduled next month to speak at a parapsychological conference. I just got done speaking at another parapsychology. So I've studied parapsychology extensively, and there's just really good evidence that that psychic functioning is real. And Aquinas was right when he said, okay, it looks like there's this faculty of the human soul to discern the future in some situations, especially, he pointed out, in dreams, which modern parapsychological findings have confirmed. 60% of spontaneous precognitive experiences occur in the context of a realistic dream. It's been discovered. Aquinas referred to precognition. It didn't have that name back then, but he referred to it as natural prophecy to distinguish it from the supernatural prophecy that God gives. Another advocate of precognition was even the earlier figure who is also a doctor of the church, Pope St. Gregory the Great, or Pope St. Gregory the First. He, in his dialogues, talks about precognition, and he says sometimes through a subtle power of the soul, it has the ability to perceive the future. So both he and Aquinas, as Catholic doctors of the church, they believed in psychic functioning. And so it's interesting to see the breadth of the tradition on that point, because most people would not suspect, if they hadn't done a detailed study, that Thomas Aquinas and Pope St. Gregory the Great are both advocates of psychic powers existing for reals as things God built into human nature. But as a result of all the parapsychological study I've done, I've now seen a lot of evidence for things that challenge a purely materialistic, naturalistic worldview. Just to give you an example, I'm keeping this kind of top level because of the time, that we've been going. But I did a recent episode of Mysterious World on a set of experiments that were published by the psychologist Daryl Bem in 2011. The episode is called "Feeling the Future," which is the name of the article he announced these experiments in. And based on what he found, and then he made it easy for people to replicate his experiments, he found astonishing statistical evidence in favor of precognition being real. To give you a parallel example, in physics, now there's a measurement that's used in probability called a sigma. A sigma is one standard deviation from the mean. And so if you're one standard deviation away, that's called 1 sigma. If you're 2 standard deviations away, that's 2 sigma, then 3 sigma, and so forth. In physics, which is considered, one of the hardest sciences there is, as opposed to soft sciences, not meaning difficulty, but rigorous. In physics, you can announce the discovery of a new particle when it achieves 5 sigma significance. So 6 sigma significance is considered more than sufficient proof. Okay. As a result of the Feel in the Future precognition experiments conducted by Daryl Bem and those who replicated them, there is better than 6 sigma significance evidence in favor of precognition. So this is considered, and the former head of the American Academy of Statisticians, Jessica Utz, has said this has been proved as well as anything else in science. It's just not commonly talked about in those terms because of the taboo regarding it created by various skeptical materialists.
Again, faith and reason. I'm so fortunate that you're sharing this, Jimmy, because it touches on exactly something that I think many listeners struggle on. And I will absolutely see if we can link to that below. Feeling the Future, I think you said, is the name of the article. That's awesome.
And the name of the episode where I cover it and the scientific controversy it led to.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. We will, listeners, please check the links below for checking out that episode as well as Jimmy's other episodes too.
And that's part one of Jimmy's two-part interview on the podcast Glitch Bottle. Jimmy, is there anything you'd like to say before we close?
I'd just like to say thank you to Alexander Eth and his listeners for the invitation to have a discussion on Glitch Bottle and for all their simulating questions.
Very good. Jimmy, what further resources can we offer to the listeners and viewers?
We'll have links to the Glitch Bottle YouTube channel and also their homepage.
And so now we turn to our mysterious feedback brought to us by our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi, on the Bigfoot biology. And the first bit of feedback does come from Rob himself, who says, "Hey, Jimmy, just listened to the Bigfoot biology episode, and two things come to mind since you mentioned you've been doing a loose series of Bigfoot stuff. One, you mentioned that Sasquatch is a Native American word for Bigfoot. If you're going to do more Bigfoot episodes, could you please do a deeper dive on how Native Americans clearly had history of such creatures and what their experiences of them were?"
To the extent I'm able to get information on that, and I know I have some, but to the extent I am able to get good information on that, I do plan on incorporating that in future episodes. It may take the form of an episode specifically devoted to Native American thought on Sasquatch, or it may be incorporated into other episodes, but I do plan on covering that kind of information.
Okay. And then the second part of his question, from what I remember of this and previous episodes, while you've connected skunk apes to Bigfoot, you've yet to connect them with Yetis, Yowies, Almas, and even Orang-Pendeks. Could what you be reporting on Bigfoot apply to them all, or are they different enough to be cryptids of their own categories?
So for the moment, I've been focusing primarily on Bigfoot or Sasquatch here in North America, and it's even possible that here in North America there might be different species, assuming that such creatures exist at all. There could be different species of them here in North America. I haven't broadened out yet to the ones reported in other areas like in Asia or in the South Pacific, but I plan to do that in the future. One of the things I plan to do is look at them to the extent possible based on the kind of species they might be. Just because it's an unknown primate that's hairy doesn't make it a Bigfoot. And so there are reported differences between the different creatures that you mentioned that could suggest they're a different species. For example, almasties in Russia our memory serves that they're reported as typically being of similar height to humans. They're not big the way Bigfoots are. Similarly, Orang Pendek in Indonesia and those islands is reported to be smaller than humans. And so there is, in addition to Bigfoot, in the literature, there are also reports of what are sometimes called Littlefoot, meaning creatures that have smaller than human stature. And then there are ones that are kind of similar to human stature. And that would suggest that we may be dealing with different species here. And so I'll be looking at them in separate episodes.
Then James Hamill on Facebook writes, "I wonder what their intelligence level is and therefore how ethical it would be to keep them in captivity if we wanted to help preserve them from extinction. I suspect we would prefer a non-interference approach, but would people abide by that realistically? I get the feeling they may be more intelligent than other primates, probably if they are a step between us and other primates, and therefore it would feel like captivity would seem too much like slavery or imprisonment."
Yeah, and not only is intelligence a factor here, but how they react to captivity is something that also would be a relevant factor. Some species respond better to captivity than others, and so that would definitely be one of the factors that would need to be considered in would it be ethical to have a captive population in order to help preserve the species.
Yeah, and then there's like those remote tribes that out there. Like there's like a tribe on an island. I think the Sentinel Islands off of India.
North Sentinel Island. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean that's one way that we've helped preserve is by just saying no go here.
Or the tribe will kill you if you do.
Yes, there was that unwise young man who went. And then Da Rock on Tour on Discord writes, something's been bugging me about one of the sightings in this episode, assuming it was an actual Bigfoot sighting. Why would something that big bite a deer's neck to kill it? Clubbing it with an arm or fist must be faster and more efficient. Heck, it probably has the strength to slap it to death. If it was anything other than a primate, I would agree with the basic instinct explanation. I'm not saying that it's impossible. It just seems very odd that something will throw large rocks and bang trees, wouldn't also use the reach of their arms to their advantage when hunting. A lot of animals that hunt and kill with a jugular bite will do so on a pounce. Apes will bite when fighting, but as far as I know, not in this manner. To attempt a jugular bite without pouncing or something similar seems very risky, as it puts your own most vulnerable spot in reach. I fully admit this is almost certainly my overthinking this by 110%.
Well, it's good to think things through. There are some additional possibilities. If memory serves, the particular instance that you're referring to from the Bigfoot biology episode dealt with the possibility that Bigfoots use infrasound as a hunting tool, the same way tigers do, to stun their prey. And so in the case in question, a Bigfoot had done a growl and then made a vocalization, and then the deer appeared stunned, and it was while the deer was stunned that the Bigfoot bit its neck. Now, it didn't say jugular. It was a jugular bite. It could have been a spine snapping bite. If their jaw is powerful enough, and according to some, they may have a sagittal crest to enable them to have a super powerful bite. But they could also do a quick bite to snap its neck, as well as going for the jugular. So there's more than one way they could kill them there. And if the animal is already stunned because of infrasound, then it could be safer for it to use that method.
And then Laser Velociraptor on YouTube writes, the lack of any bodily remains, not even fragmentary skeletal pieces, and the lack of good footage, even though high-quality cameras have become more common, rules out their existence. At least with normal animals, when you find their bedding areas, you could put up trail cameras, and even if they bury their dead, those graves would have been spotted at this point. The evidence presented is rather lackluster. Some strange sounds and some strangely arranged branches. It's stuff that could have been caused by other things, such as other animals or human kids.
Well, I recognize that this is an objection that has some force, because we do find other animals on trail cams and camera traps and things like that. But there are also some rebuttals to this argument that have been proposed. One that we've already touched on a little bit in the episode on the Honabi Bigfoot siege is there may be some evidence that trail cams, especially the ones that rely on infrared light to detect the animals, that may be visible to Bigfoots, and they may avoid them because they don't like those lights in the woods. So that's one possible explanation, and there are others that we can consider in the future.
One of the things that's come up in my discussions with folks is anyone who spent any amount of time outdoors will tell you don't actually find remains, bones, that often.
You don't, and that's definitely something we'll be covering in the future, but I'm just focusing specifically on trail cams. They don't always work, and more intelligent creatures who can see infrared may have ways of avoiding them.
Yeah. All right, so that does it for our feedback this time, and now it's time to hear from you about this episode. What are your theories about demons, magic, and the concepts that Jimmy discussed today? You can let us know online by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @MYS_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/Discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work in this episode. Be sure and check it out at youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, be sure and like, comment, and subscribe and hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video.
So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, I'll be taking more questions from the listeners of Glitch Bottle, and so we'll be taking another look at the world of grimoires, ceremonial magic, and a Catholic perspective on it.
Very good. Folks, be sure to check out the Mysterious World bookstore at mysteriousworldstore.com for links to all the books and videos that Jimmy mentions in the show. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/382. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at gradygroupinc.com. And by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Tom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.